The morning sun was soft and warm, spreading a golden light across the small town. The air was filled with excitement as families got ready for the big day. It was graduation day, a day every parent waits for. Among them stood a man in a crisp Marine uniform, polished shoes and a chest full of medals that told silent stories of years spent serving his country. He had woken up early, even before the alarm. Old habits never leave easily. After all, he had spent most of his adult life waking before dawn, following strict routines and keeping every detail in order. But this morning was different. It wasn't about drills or duties. It was about his son, the boy he had watched grow from a shy little kid into a confident young man. He looked at his reflection in the mirror, adjusting his collar with care. His wife smiled softly from the doorway. "You look perfect," she said. He smiled back, though a small part of him wondered if wearing his uniform would draw attention. But it wasn't about pride or showing off. To him, it was about respect, for his son, for what the day meant, and for the life that had shaped them both. When they arrived at the school, the parking lot was already full. Families stood near their cars, holding bouquets, cameras, and balloons. The Marine stepped out of the car and helped his wife with her bag. Heads turned. Some people smiled politely, while others gave curious looks. A few whispered to each other, eyes lingering on his medals. He brushed it off. He had faced far worse than a few stares. Inside, the auditorium buzzed with energy. Parents chatting, teachers giving last-minute instructions, students laughing nervously behind the stage curtains. Rows of chairs filled quickly as everyone waited for the ceremony to begin. The Marine found his seat in the front row, reserved for families of students receiving special awards. His son was one of them. He had been chosen for the Leadership Award, a recognition that meant more than grades or trophies. The Marine couldn't have been prouder, but as he sat down, two staff members approached. One of them leaned closer and said quietly, "Sir, would you mind removing your jacket? It's, attracting too much attention." He looked up, unsure if he had heard right. "My jacket?" he asked calmly. "Yes," the other staff member said quickly. "We just want to keep the focus on the students today. The uniform, it's quite noticeable." For a moment he said nothing. Years of discipline kept him from reacting instantly. He had been taught to stay calm even when emotions ran high. Still, the words stung. "This uniform," he said slowly, "is part of who I am. I wore it to honor my son. I'm not trying to take attention away from anyone." The staff exchanged an uneasy glance. "We understand, sir, but we'd really appreciate it if you could just maybe take it off for the ceremony." His wife looked uncomfortable, glancing between them. "He's not doing anything wrong," she said softly. But the staff members stood firm, their polite smiles starting to fade. He took a deep breath. He could have argued, could have reminded them what this uniform represented. Sacrifice, service, and years spent far from home. But instead he simply nodded. "If it'll make things easier," he said quietly. He unbuttoned his jacket and folded it neatly over his arm, revealing the plain white shirt underneath. When the staff walked away, his wife touched his hand. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered. He gave a small smile. "It's all right. Today's about our boy." But deep down, the moment left a heavy feeling. The uniform had always been more than fabric and metal. It was a symbol of everything he had stood for: loyalty, courage, honor. And now being asked to take it off made him feel small in a place where he should have felt proud. As people continued finding their seats, a few nearby parents began whispering again. Some smiled politely, pretending not to notice. Others just looked away. It wasn't anger he felt, it was disappointment. After all the years he had spent protecting the values of this country, here he was, being told his uniform wasn't welcome at his own son's ceremony. His mind wandered for a moment, back to the desert heat, to nights spent awake listening for distant sounds, to the faces of brothers who never made it home. He had carried their memory in every medal, every stripe, every crease of that jacket, and now, sitting there holding it folded in his lap, he felt their silence more than ever. His son hadn't seen what had happened. He was backstage getting ready to walk across that stage, nervous but excited. The Marine didn't want to ruin that for him. He straightened up, set his jacket neatly beside him, and waited for the program to begin. But the feeling didn't go away. Every time someone glanced in his direction, it reminded him of that small humiliation. His wife tried to distract him with conversation, but he could sense she was upset too. He looked around the hall. Flags decorated the walls. The school's band prepared to play the national anthem. He stood up respectfully as the first notes began, hand over his heart. The crowd followed, some half-heartedly. He sang quietly under his breath, his voice steady, his pride unbroken. When the song ended, he sat back down, feeling the eyes of a few people still on him. He ignored them. His focus stayed on the stage, waiting for the moment his son would appear. What he didn't know was that his old Marine friends, the brothers who had shared his toughest years, had planned to surprise him that day. They were already on their way, dressed in full uniform, eager to stand beside him and celebrate his son's achievement. But for now, he sat alone in that crowded hall, holding his jacket, pretending not to notice the looks, silently reminding himself that dignity doesn't depend on how others treat you. It depends on how you choose to respond. The announcer's voice echoed through the hall, calling the ceremony to order. The Marine sat taller, hands resting on his knees, heart full of quiet pride. He had faced storms, battles, and loss. A few whispers couldn't break him. Still, something deep inside him knew this day wasn't going to end the way anyone expected. The ceremony began with cheerful music and applause. Students lined up near the stage, some adjusting their caps, others laughing nervously. Parents clapped, cameras flashed, and the school principal gave the usual opening speech. The Marine tried to focus on the words, but his mind kept replaying what had just happened. Those few sentences that stripped him of his moment of pride. He sat still, hands folded, trying not to show the mix of hurt and anger building inside him. Years of training had taught him to control his emotions. In the service, losing your temper could mean losing control of a situation. But here, in a room full of civilians, it was different. No one saw the discipline behind his silence. They only saw a man sitting quietly with a folded jacket on his lap. From across the hall, a few parents kept sneaking glances his way. Some of them probably didn't mean any harm. Maybe they were just curious. But a few had expressions that carried judgment, like he had done something wrong simply by showing up proud of who he was. He didn't understand it. Weren't people supposed to respect the uniform? The same one that represented those who had protected their freedom? His wife squeezed his hand gently, trying to comfort him. "Don't let it ruin this day," she whispered. He nodded, forcing a small smile. "I'm fine," he said. But deep down he wasn't. Something inside him felt off. It wasn't just about the uniform, and it was about what it meant. For so many years he had worn it as a sign of commitment, a promise to serve and protect. And now it felt like that promise didn't mean much to some people anymore. As he sat there lost in thought, a familiar sound echoed in his mind. The sharp whistle of morning drills, the firm voice of his commander, the clatter of boots on hard ground. For a brief second he was back there, in the heat, in the noise, surrounded by his brothers in arms. They had always stood together. No one was ever left behind. He blinked and came back to the present as the applause started again. Another group of students had received their diplomas. He looked around, realizing how long it had been since he'd seen his old comrades. They used to meet once a year, but life had a way of scattering everyone in different directions. Still, they had never lost touch. He just didn't know that today, they were planning something that would change everything. A teacher stepped up to the microphone and began calling names for the special awards. His heart began to race. His son's name would be called soon. The Marine sat straighter, eyes focused on the stage. He could see his son waiting nervously in line, adjusting his gown and cap. His boy had worked hard for this moment, late nights, long hours, and quiet determination. He wanted him to see his father proud, sitting tall in that uniform, but instead his uniform was folded beside him. That thought stung again. Nearby, one of the same staff members who had asked him to remove his jacket was now helping organize students on stage. The Marine caught his eye for a moment. The man looked away quickly, pretending to be busy. It wasn't anger that filled the Marine's chest, but something heavier, disappointment. Then something unexpected happened. As the teacher continued calling names, a small commotion started near the entrance of the auditorium. The sound of firm footsteps echoed through the aisle. The crowd turned their heads, whispering among themselves. The Marine glanced back and froze. Walking through the doors were several men in full Marine dress uniforms. Their movements were steady, their faces calm but serious. Every step carried weight. Every medal told a story. The people who had been whispering earlier went silent. The Marine's eyes widened. He recognized them instantly. They were his old brothers, men he had served with years ago. They looked older, a few more wrinkles, a few more scars, but the pride in their eyes was the same. His wife covered her mouth in surprise. "You didn't tell me they were coming," she whispered. "I didn't know," he said softly, still staring in disbelief. The group of Marines walked down the aisle until they reached him. Without saying a word, one of them placed a firm hand on his shoulder. The simple gesture said everything. "We're here with you." The audience watched quietly. Even the principal stopped speaking, unsure what to do. The presence of those men filled the room with something powerful: respect. The same parents who had been whispering earlier now sat in silence, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats. One of the Marines, a tall man with gray hair, gave a small nod. The Marine sitting in the audience stood up slowly. The two men exchanged a silent look, one only those who've been through battle together could understand. No words were needed. Then, almost naturally, the rest of the Marines turned toward the flag hanging near the stage. The audience followed their gaze. For a long moment, no one spoke. It was as if the entire room had stopped breathing. The pride, the respect, the brotherhood, it all filled the space like a quiet storm. After a few seconds, the group stepped aside, standing near the back of the hall. The Marine sat back down, but this time he didn't feel small. He didn't feel embarrassed. He placed his jacket back on, buttoned it up slowly, and sat tall once again. His son, still waiting backstage, noticed the movement through the curtain. His eyes widened when he saw the group of Marines standing there. He knew exactly who they were, his father's old brothers, the ones he'd heard stories about growing up. The boy's chest swelled with pride. Whatever had happened before didn't matter now. His dad wasn't sitting alone anymore. The principal cleared his throat and tried to continue with the ceremony, but his voice trembled slightly. The crowd's attention had shifted completely. It was no longer just a graduation. It had become something else, something deeper. As the speeches went on, the Marine's thoughts quieted. The weight he'd felt earlier slowly lifted. His brothers had always known when one of their own needed support, even without saying a word. That was what made them family. By the time his son's name was finally called, the Marine's heart was steady. He looked toward the stage, his uniform shining once again under the lights. His son stepped out from behind the curtain, shoulders straight, eyes bright. He didn't need to say a thing. He could feel the pride in his father's eyes from across the room. The Marine took a deep breath, feeling the strength of his brothers behind him. Whatever had started as a moment of disrespect was turning into something unforgettable. And deep down, he knew this was only the beginning of what the day would bring. The sound of his son's name being called echoed across the hall. For a moment, everything else disappeared. The Marine's heart pounded with pride as he watched his son walk across the stage. Head held high. The audience clapped, and flashes from cameras filled the room, but his eyes stayed locked on his boy. He couldn't stop smiling. His son had no idea what had happened earlier. He didn't know about the whispers or how his father had been asked to remove his uniform. All he saw now was his dad sitting tall again, wearing that same uniform with pride, surrounded by the men who had once stood beside him in battle. The sight filled him with courage. When he reached the center of the stage to receive his diploma, he paused for a second. His eyes scanned the crowd until they met his father's. For a brief moment, it was as if the entire room faded away. The two of them shared a look that needed no words. It was pride, respect, and love all wrapped into one quiet glance. The principal handed the diploma with a polite smile, but even he seemed slightly uneasy under the weight of the silence that had fallen over the crowd. The presence of those Marines at the back of the room had changed everything. Their calm, dignified stance carried more authority than any speech or ceremony could. The Marine sat there, still and steady. His brothers stood behind him like a wall of silent strength. Every so often, one of them would nod slightly, acknowledging a small victory, not just for him, but for the respect that had been momentarily taken away and now restored. After his son stepped off the stage, the ceremony continued, but it no longer felt the same. The crowd that had once whispered now sat in quiet admiration. Some people clapped a little louder. Some stood a little taller when the next names were called. The energy in the room had shifted completely. The Marine's wife looked at him, eyes shining with tears she tried to hide. They came for you, she whispered. He gave a small smile. They always do, he said softly. It was true. Through years of service, he had learned that Marines were more than soldiers. They were family. No matter where life took them, when one of their own needed support, they showed up. Sometimes without a call, without a message, they just knew. As the principal wrapped up the ceremony, thanking the guests and students, the crowd slowly began to stand and stretch. People gathered their belongings, took pictures, and chatted among themselves. But the Marine stayed seated for a moment, taking it all in. He looked at his uniform, the medals glinting under the bright lights. For a while earlier, he had felt ashamed, not of himself, but of how others had seen him. Now he felt nothing but pride. The same uniform that had once drawn judgment was now commanding respect in the very same room. As the last student left the stage, the band began to play the closing song. The Marine stood up, buttoned his jacket properly, and adjusted his collar. His brothers behind him followed suit, standing straight, hands at their sides, eyes forward. The audience noticed. A hush spread again. The sight of the group standing together, proud, still, and dignified, was powerful. The music played softly in the background, but it was their presence that spoke louder than anything else. His son came running down from the stage, holding his diploma tightly. When he saw his father, he stopped in his tracks. The boy's eyes widened, seeing not just his dad, but the men who had once fought alongside him. Without a second thought, the boy walked straight to his father, stood in front of him, and raised his hand in a sharp salute. The crowd went silent once more. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The Marine looked at his son, his throat tightening. Slowly, he returned the salute, his hand steady and firm. It was a simple gesture, but it carried years of respect and love. Then the hall erupted into applause, loud, sincere, and long. People stood up, clapping harder than they had at any other point during the ceremony. Some parents even wiped their eyes. The teachers looked at one another, realizing the depth of what they had just witnessed. The Marine didn't smile at first. He just stood there, proud, his son's salute still fresh in his mind. His brothers behind him nodded approvingly. They knew what that moment meant, not just for him, but for every Marine who had ever felt unappreciated after returning home. When the applause finally faded, the Marine reached out and hugged his son. It wasn't a long or dramatic hug, just a simple, quiet one that said everything neither of them could put into words. "I'm proud of you," Sos, he whispered. "I'm proud of you too, Dad," the boy replied softly. After a moment, the rest of the families began to move out of the hall. People approached the Marines to shake their hands, thanking them for their service. The same parents who had looked uncomfortable before now smiled warmly. A few of them even apologized quietly for how things had started. The Marine didn't hold grudges. He just nodded politely, his expression calm and respectful. "Thank you," he said each time, his voice steady. He wasn't looking for pity or attention, just simple respect. As the crowd thinned out, the Marine turned to his brothers. "Didn't expect to see you today," he said, his voice low but filled with emotion. One of them chuckled softly. "We heard what happened," he said. "Didn't sit right with us. Thought we'd come remind them what that uniform stands for." The Marine laughed lightly, shaking his head. "You guys never change." "Wouldn't be Marines if we did," one of them replied. Grinning, they all shared a brief laugh, the kind that comes from shared history, from years of having each other's backs no matter the situation. His wife joined them, smiling with gratitude. "You have good friends," she said. He nodded. "The best kind," he replied. As they all walked out of the hall together, the setting sun painted the sky in shades of gold and orange. The Marine looked back once more at the building where the day had started so differently. What began as a moment of humiliation had turned into a moment of honor, not because he fought back with anger, but because he stood tall with dignity and grace. He placed his arm around his son's shoulder as they walked toward the car. His brothers followed close behind, talking quietly and laughing like old times. The Marine smiled to himself. The lesson was clear. Respect isn't demanded or forced. It's earned through quiet strength, through standing firm even when others don't understand. And though the ceremony had ended, the memory of that day would live on, not just for him and his son, but for everyone who witnessed what true honor looks like. The sun had started to set when the crowd finally left the school grounds. The Marine stood outside the auditorium, his jacket still neatly buttoned, his medals shining faintly in. His son stood beside him, holding his diploma tightly, while the group of Marines gathered near the parking lot, talking and laughing softly like old times. The ceremony was over, but something still lingered in the air, a quiet sense of respect that hadn't been there earlier. Even as people walked past, many stopped to nod politely or say a few words of appreciation. The same staff member who had asked him to remove his jacket earlier approached, looking uncomfortable but sincere. "Sir," the man began, his voice low, "I just wanted to apologize. I didn't mean to be disrespectful earlier. I was only following a guideline about formal dress codes, but I realize now that I was wrong." The Marine looked at him calmly. For a moment he said nothing. The silence wasn't angry and it was thoughtful. Finally he gave a small nod. "Thank you," he said simply. "It takes a good man to admit when he's wrong." The staff member looked relieved and shook his hand. "Thank you for your service," he said before walking away. The Marine watched him go, feeling no bitterness, only peace. He had spent years learning how to handle difficult situations with patience and grace. Losing his temper had never won him respect. His composure had. His son turned to him and said quietly, "I saw the way people looked at you earlier, Dad. I didn't like it. But when your friends came in, everything changed." The Marine smiled gently. "That's what happens when people see unity," he said. "One man can be ignored, but when brothers stand together, people listen." The boy nodded slowly, letting the words sink in. He had always looked up to his father, but today he understood what respect really meant. It wasn't about rank or medals. It was about how a person carried themselves no matter what others said. As they stood there talking, one of the Marines called out, "Hey, old man, you coming or what?" The group laughed and the Marine chuckled. "You haven't changed a bit," he said, walking toward them. They all decided to grab dinner together before heading home. They found a small diner nearby, one that looked like it hadn't changed in decades. Old photos on the wall, a neon sign flickering in the window, and the smell of coffee and fried food filling the air. Inside, the group of Marines took up 2 tables, pushing them together. They ordered burgers, fries, and coffee. Simple food, but it felt like a feast. The waitress looked surprised to see so many men in uniform at once. "Well, aren't you a fine bunch?" she said with a warm smile. They laughed and thanked her politely. The Marine's son sat beside him, listening quietly as the men shared old stories. They talked about the time they got stuck in a sandstorm overseas, about the day one of them accidentally set a field kitchen on fire, and about the times they didn't think they'd make it home. There was laughter, but also moments of quiet, the kind that come when people remember things that words can't fully describe. At one point, the Marine's son leaned forward and asked, "Do you guys still talk often?" One of the older Marines smiled. "We try to. Life gets busy, but when one of us needs something, the others show up. That's how it works," the boy nodded. "That's really cool," he said. Another Marine looked at him and said, "Your dad was one of the toughest and kindest men we ever served with. You should be proud." The boy smiled, and the Marine just shook his head modestly. "I had good men beside me," he said. The rest of the night went by in laughter and memories. For the first time in a long while, the Marine felt at home. There was something comforting about being surrounded by the same people who had seen him at his strongest and his weakest. When they finally left the diner, the sky was dark and the air had cooled. The parking lot was quiet except for the hum of distant traffic. One by one, his brothers said their goodbyes, giving him firm handshakes and strong hugs, the kind that said more than words ever could. "Take care of yourself," one of them said. "You too," he replied. "And thank you for showing up today," one of them smiled. "You'd have done the same for any of us," the Marine nodded. "Always." As they drove away, he stood there for a moment, watching their taillights fade into the distance. His son came up beside him. "They really respect you," the boy said quietly. The Marine looked down at him and smiled. "Respect isn't given," he said. "It's earned day by day. You don't get it from a uniform or a title. You earn it by the way you treat people, even when they don't treat you the same way." His son nodded slowly. "I'll remember that," he said. They got into the car and drove home in silence for a while. The Marine's wife rested her head against the window, tired but smiling softly. His son sat in the back seat, scrolling through photos from the ceremony, the moment on stage, the salute, and the group of Marines standing tall behind his dad. When they reached home, The Marine placed his jacket carefully on the hanger, smoothing out the wrinkles. For a moment he stared at it. It wasn't just a piece of clothing. It was part of his life, every tear, every scar, every moment of pride. He turned to his wife, who was setting down her bag. "You know," he said quietly, "I almost didn't wear it today. I thought maybe it would draw attention." She looked at him and smiled. "I'm glad you did, because it reminded everyone what real honor looks like." He smiled softly. "Maybe so." Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, he stepped outside into the cool night air. The sky was clear, the stars shining brightly above. He looked up, hands in his pockets, thinking about the day, the disrespect, the support, the pride, and the peace that followed. He realized that life wasn't about being understood by everyone. It was about standing true to who you are, no matter what others say. His brothers had reminded him of that. His son had learned it. And he had lived it. The world might change. People might forget what uniforms mean, but the values, loyalty, respect, honor, those never fade. As he stood there under the stars, a faint smile crossed his face. The day had begun with disappointment, but it ended with a lesson, one that no one who witnessed it would ever forget. After the ceremony ended, the Marine stayed seated for a while, letting the sound of clapping fade from the hall. His son was still surrounded by his classmates, laughing, hugging, and taking pictures. The proud father didn't want to interrupt that moment. He simply sat there with quiet satisfaction, watching his boy glow with pride. The same boy who used to run around in tiny boots pretending to be a soldier was now standing tall, confident, ready for his next chapter in life. One of the teachers, the same one who had earlier asked him to take off his uniform, walked past him slowly. She didn't say anything at first, but her eyes told the story. There was regret, and maybe even a bit of embarrassment. The Marine nodded politely, not out of anger, but as a gesture that said, "It's okay. You've learned your lesson." She returned a small, nervous smile before moving away. A few minutes later, his old Marine brothers approached him. They looked at him with that familiar respect. Only those who've shared the same hardships understand. One of them clapped him on the shoulder and said quietly, "You handled that with real class, brother." The Marine smiled faintly. "We've faced worse," he replied. They all chuckled softly, the kind of laughter that comes from shared memories of things no one else could truly grasp. Outside, the schoolyard was filled with students and families taking pictures. The Marine stepped out into the sunlight with his fellow brothers. The bright sky seemed to match the new energy in the air. As they walked out, parents turned to look, not with judgment this time, but with admiration. A few even came forward, shaking their hands, thanking them for their service. One man said, "I didn't realize who you were earlier, sir. That was powerful back there." The Marine simply nodded and replied, "It's not about me. It's about what the uniform stands for." Just then, his son spotted him across the crowd and came running toward him. His graduation gown flapped in the breeze and his cap hung loosely in his hand. When he reached his father, he didn't say a word at first. He just wrapped his arms around him and held on tight. The Marine felt the warmth of his son's embrace, and for a moment, all the noise around them disappeared. "I saw what happened earlier," the boy said quietly. "You didn't deserve that, Dad." The Marine shook his head gently. "It's all right, son. Sometimes people don't understand what they haven't lived through. What matters is how we carry ourselves, even when others don't show respect." His son looked up, eyes shining. "You didn't say anything, but everyone saw how strong you were. You taught me more today than any speech ever could." That moment hit deep. The Marine had seen his share of battlefields, had lived through chaos and loss, but this, standing beside his son, seeing him grow into a man who understood dignity, felt like the greatest victory of all. A group of classmates approached, asking for pictures. The son proudly introduced his father to each one. "This is my dad," he said. "He's a Marine." The pride in his voice was impossible to miss. The Marine smiled, letting his son enjoy the moment. His friends, once just curious teenagers, now looked at him with genuine respect. Later, the group of Marines gathered by their cars. They didn't need long speeches or emotional farewells, just a firm handshake and a nod of understanding. Before leaving, one of them said, "You reminded everyone today what respect really means." The Marine nodded quietly, grateful for his brother's presence. They had appeared at the perfect time without being called. That was the bond of service, unspoken but unbreakable. When everyone had gone, the Marine and his son sat on a bench outside the hall. The sun was starting to set, painting the sky in soft orange shades. The Marine glanced at his son and said, "You did well today. I'm proud of you," his son smiled. "I just wanted you to be there, Dad. That's all that mattered to me." The Marine looked down at his hands, calloused and strong from years of work, and said softly, "You know, when I joined the Marines, I didn't do it for medals or praise. I did it to serve. But today, seeing you walk that stage, that felt like my true reward." The boy leaned back and said, "I think everyone in that room learned something today, including me." The Marine chuckled. "Maybe, but remember, respect doesn't always come easy. Sometimes you have to stand tall and let your actions speak louder than words." As they sat there, a few more families passed by, still whispering about what they had seen earlier. Some stopped to shake the Marine's hand. A mother said, "Your moment with your son? It brought tears to my eyes." The Marine smiled politely and thanked her. He didn't want attention, but he was glad the moment had touched people in a good way. Later that evening, when they reached home, the Marine placed his uniform carefully back in its case. His son walked in holding his graduation photo. It showed the two of them standing together, surrounded by Marines in uniform. The Marine stared at it for a long time, silent. "That's going in the living room," his son said firmly. "Everyone should see it." The Marine laughed softly. "You think so?" "Yeah," the son replied. "Because that picture doesn't just show a ceremony. It shows what real honor looks like." The Marine looked at him, feeling a deep sense of peace. He had faced many battles in life, but the lesson that day had been about something far more important than courage in combat. It was about dignity, patience, and quiet strength in the face of ignorance. Before heading to bed, he stepped out onto the porch. The air was cool and calm. He looked up at the stars and thought of all the men and women he'd served with, those who had stood by him even years after leaving the battlefield. Brotherhood wasn't something that ended when the uniform came off. It lived on in moments like this, in bonds that time couldn't break. That night, as he closed his eyes, he knew one thing for certain. What happened at that ceremony wasn't just a story about disrespect or pride. It was a story about how character reveals itself when tested, and how true honor never needs to be shouted. It simply stands quietly and lets the world see. The next morning, he found a note on the kitchen table from his son. It read, "Thank you for showing me what strength really means. I'll carry your lessons wherever I go." The Marine smiled. For the first time in a long while, he felt complete. The world hadn't changed overnight, but something inside him had. And perhaps, something inside everyone who witnessed that moment had changed too. And though he didn't seek recognition or applause, one thing became clear that day. Respect isn't demanded, it's inspired. And when it's earned through grace, humility, and courage, it echoes louder than any uniform ever could.